Hey everyone, welcome to the Sex, Bodies, and Cinema podcast. I'm Jason Good, one of the co-hosts of the show, along with Ashley Rose. This podcast takes a close look at films that explore sexuality and embodiment, with the aim to make space for what is, for many of us, a taboo subject. I'm a former screenwriter and director, and Ashley is a former actor. Both of us now work in the field of somatic sex education. You can find out more about Ashley and her work at ashleyelizabethrose.ca. You can find me at somarelating.ca. There you will find my hidden relationship patterns quiz that will help you identify some of the issues we often discuss in these episodes. It's free with your email, and you can also order the companion ebook that unpacks the different patterns that can undermine intimacy and offers suggestions for improving how you show up in relationships. Go to the show notes and click on the link to take it today. Today's film is the 2009 coming-of-age story, An Education. The film was directed by Lone Scherfig from a screenplay by Nick Hornby, based on the memoir by Lynn Barber. Our guest today is Jamie Lee Finch. Jamie is an author, educator, facilitator, and body worker. She co-hosts the podcast Experiential Anatomy with Dr. Joan Chan and is the author of You Are Your Own, A Reckoning with the Religious Trauma of Evangelical Christianity. Her website is jamieleefinch.com, and you can find her on Instagram at Jamie Lee Finch. The links will be in the show notes. Without further delay, here is our episode on Lone Scherfig's An Education.
Action is character. If we never did anything, we wouldn't be anybody.
How's it watching the trailer, Jamie? You said for the first time.
Emotional. I mean, the score really gets you. Like, they nailed it with that really sweeping. Yeah, it's interesting watching the trailer, knowing the movie so intimately and knowing the ways in which the kind of artistic feel of the trailer kind of nails the feel of the movie, but the way the trailer's cut is not synonymous with the actual unfolding of the plot of the movie, as is, I guess, a lot of trailers can tend to do that. But yeah, it still got me in the feels. Felt good.
A couple of the lines really popped for me, more so I think because they're highlighted in the trailer more than in the movie. But that line, I suppose you think of me as a ruined woman. And Emma Thompson playing the headmistress is like, you're not a woman.
It's such a beautiful trailer, and I love how they've used the wonderful singer in the jazz club as the overarching kind of, for me, jazz represents symbolically the finding the hidden corners of life. You know, you always want to find the stuffy jazz club with a singer who maybe hasn't been found out yet, or the famous singer who wants to have fun slumming it with some really great musicians on a Saturday afternoon, and you just luck out. And it's just like this symbol of life and something happening. And then they kind of sweep in with the more classical music that David and Jenny bond over and that she plays. And it just feels sweet. I agree with you. It's a very easily felt. It gives quite a bit away for me, a little bit. Not everything, but it's very touching.
Well, and that's what's interesting, though, way in which the trailer kind of tells you the story, I believe is not actually the story of the movie. So it seems like it gives something away, but it feels almost like if you're watching this movie in the way that I really feel like it desires to be watched and understood, the trailer actually kind of presents the proper diversion for you to go into watching this movie thinking it's about one thing, and it's only through watching it that you discover it's actually about something totally different. I love that.
That's great. It'll be fun to unpack your thoughts on that. Let me introduce the podcast. This is Sex, Bodies, and Cinema. I'm Jason.
I'm Ashley.
This is a podcast about films that tackle the subjects of sexuality and embodiment. It's a conversation show where we'll unpack the films from our perspective as both former artists and practicing somatic sex educators. Today's film is An Education, the 2009 coming-of-age drama based on a memoir by British journalist Lynn Barber. The film was directed by Lone Scherfig from a screenplay by Nick Hornby. It stars Carey Mulligan as Jenny, a bright schoolgirl, and Peter Sarsgaard as David, the charming con man who seduces her. The film was nominated for 3 Academy Awards in 2010: Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay for Nick Hornby, and Best Actress for Carey Mulligan. Our guest today is Jamie Lee Finch. Jamie is an author, educator, facilitator, and body worker. She co-hosts the podcast Experiential Anatomy with Dr. Joan Chan and is the author of You Are Your Own, A Reckoning with the Religious Trauma of Evangelical Christianity. Her website is jamieleefinch.com, and you can find her on Instagram at Jamie Lee Finch. The links will be in the show notes. She also has an online course called Your Body is a Person, which I wanted to highlight here because I encountered Jamie a few years ago as a podcast guest herself and have followed her online since that point. And her online presence and materials This was the first time I ever heard from someone this idea that your body was a person. Jamie was the person who told me that for the first time. And I remember that being a really important moment in my life and instigating my curiosity about somatic or body-based work, which eventually led me toward somatic sex educator training, as well as the somatic experiencing practitioner training and seeking out my own somatic coaches. So I'm just delighted, Jamie, that you're here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So I came to you and just was like, I do this podcast. I'm a huge fan of yours. Would you be interested in doing this? You had an enthusiastic yes, which was really
I think that
nice.
was my fastest responded to email of my entire career of receiving like professional inquiries from others. It was so fast. Yeah. And I knew right away what movie I wanted to talk about.
Yes. So you were like an education. And so I have never seen it. I knew about it. I remember when it popped and Carey Mulligan in the Best Picture. I had never gotten around to seeing it. So I was intrigued. When did you first see it?
Shortly after it first came out. So it was released in the States in 2010. I guess the official release was February 2010. I don't have a clear memory of exactly when, after its initial release, I saw it, but it feels like it was within the first month or two of it being out. So I was 21 years old. I think the context of my life when I first saw it matters quite a bit. In January of 2010, I had just moved back to St. Louis after trying to make it living in New York City for about a year and a half prior to that point. And I mean, I survived, but yeah, a lot happened and decided it wasn't really worth trying to continue to force pieces that weren't fitting. And I wasn't well in ways I didn't know how to articulate yet. And so I was in a real in-between moment of my life, which felt kind of like this accessing my adolescence really for the first time, because I was raised evangelical in purity culture. And so I didn't really have kind of a quintessential adolescence. And some of what made my time in New York City so disruptive is it was my first time really kind of trying to live into the authenticity of my desires and my body. And it was very messy. And I hurt myself in a lot of ways. So I found this movie. This movie found me right at that moment. So I was not a 16-year-old going on 17-year-old British schoolgirl, but boy, did I feel like it in many ways. Yeah. So that's when I first saw it.
Ashley, what about you? Had you seen this before?
I had, yeah. And I liked it because I really love the performers and I'm a big Alfred Molina girl. And I love her. I mean, she's just hard to argue with. She's so talented, Carey Mulligan. But I loved the story. But, one thing I'm learning about doing this podcast and that I was reminded of watching an education is just how our developmental stages are like watching a piece really inform what we can actually take from it. And so there was some part of me that had matured in a way where I had a whole other scope and flavor and layer. And I think it's so important because in our podcast, we're talking about how our sexuality is informed by cinema and the images that we see, and both how it takes what's going on in society and reflects it. And do we like what we're seeing and transmitting, the reception and transmission of culture and art and our own experiences. And so I was more ready, and it's very dear to me, but not as much as Jamie. I'm so excited to hear more from you about how this film has ongoingly meant something to you, but it struck me differently this time.
Yeah, it's interesting. 2010. So I would have been in a very different place. I just welcomed my second child. And I can remember when the film came out and I had a sense of what the premise was. I had already started making films at that point, but there was something about what I was sensing was about an older man and a younger woman. And I just thought, this doesn't intrigue me. I was a little
You don't think it's for you?
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Even though I usually kept up with all the Best Picture movies, I'd skipped it that year. So it was interesting to come back now and experience it with a new lens as well.
I'm even curious just with that because, I mean, that's understandable too. So when I rewatched it again for, I don't know, somewhere around probably somewhere between 30th and 40th time, just like 2 nights ago with my partner. And that is the second time in my life I've watched it with another person. The first time I saw it was with my roommate at the time. And then I have never watched it with someone else since then because it's such an intimate movie for me. And my partner, Tyler, said a similar thing where it wasn't on his radar in any way because it didn't seem like it was a movie for him. And so that makes so much sense to me, what you're describing. When we finished watching it, he said that it was the most intimate portrayal, like coming of age story of girlhood that he's ever seen or ever kind of, come across. So deeply understandable that you 15 years ago, not super interested, but I am looking forward to hearing how it landed with you now in your life position now. I recognize that Ashley and I talking about this movie at all and even how it's dear to us is very different than hearing from you as a man watching this movie. It's a totally different movie. Like you can actually watch this movie in like 7 different ways, of which I have watched it all 7 different ways. So I'm excited to hear like an in-depth communication from a man having watched this movie, how it landed with you. It's a very different experience, even different for me watching it as a younger woman and now watching it as an older woman where I'm like, closer technically character-wise to like identifying with Jenny's mother than with Jenny herself. And I'm watching it super differently thinking about my teenage daughter being in this position as opposed to me as a 21-year-old imagining my younger self finding myself in this kind of storyline. So yeah, I'm excited to hear all of your perspectives.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that because I'm, as the father of 3 teenage girls, I was reflecting on the Alfred Molina character.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Quite a bit. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
I wanted to just highlight some of the creators. We'll talk about Carey Mulligan in a little bit here, but the director Lone Scherfig and then the screenwriter Nick Hornby. I'm curious if those names have registered for you. I'll just share with you, so Scherfig, the only other film of hers I'd seen was Italian for Beginners. And so she's a Danish filmmaker. And there was this movement in the 90s called the Dogma 95 movement, where these Danish filmmakers had a kind of a manifesto of like stripped down filmmaking where there's no like music added, there's no lights. And so there's a number of celebrated movies from that era. The Celebration by Thomas Vinterberg being one of the major ones that I'm quite a fan of. Italian for Beginners was in that slew of Dogma 95 films, but that's the only, I'd never really thought about her since I saw that film. So it's surprising to see who the director was. And then Nick Hornby, About a Boy, High Fidelity. I haven't read any of his books, but those 2 films I know. I'm curious if the 2 of you have engaged or thought about those creators before.
Lone was new to me. I hadn't experienced her as a director before, but one thing that was stunning to me researching for today was just how charming everyone who was involved with the film truly is and how grounded they are in their natures and what a gem of an experience and a very unique film that they managed to make together. And she is very humble. She had this quote that I wrote down and she said, "They all think I'm a sloppy director, but they're all so faceted and courageous. I didn't need to show that I'm a director." So she didn't try to overmold the piece either. She seems to be someone who, while holding a vision and being able to steer a set, also is able to know exactly what strengths she's playing with and maneuver them. So she seems like more of a delegating director. Nick Hornby, I've never been able to have a lot of passion for him as a novelist, and I just think he's an amazing adapter and screenwriter, and I've always enjoyed like High Fidelity and About a Boy. I'm so charmed by both films, and I like him as a person. Yeah.
That's so interesting to hear that about Lone. To be honest, until preparing for this conversation, for whatever reason, I never even thought about the director of this movie, like not once. But hearing you articulate that, Ashley, it settles something in me and knowing like it could have been and would have been a very different film had there been a different approach from the director. Had she not felt into and intuited, like, I need to do so little because each one of these people are so exceptional in embodying the role and the story they're telling with the role. And I feel that most especially with Carey as Jenny, just unbelievable. So that's so interesting to hear. As far as Nick Hornby goes, I have not really engaged with much of his media over the years. I have to admit, I tried to watch High Fidelity once and I turned it off. I couldn't do it. Maybe I'll try it again someday. My story still is that I really don't like that movie. About a Boy was fine. Like it maybe a similar like Nick Hornby's kind of coming of age of boyhood into manhood has not really historically been for me. However, he did the screenplay for Wild, and I've read that book. I've watched that movie. It's one of the few book to movie adaptations that I feel like I can't decide which one I like better. That rarely happens to me.
Wow.
I'm almost always like, book, definitely. Like
Yeah.
the movie just tried too hard or tried to specify things too much, and it removed some of the imaginative quality of the experience of the book. But I felt like he did exceptionally well with that one. And Lynn Barber in her book. So if you get the education where it's both the memoir itself and then her reflection on the experience of having the memoir made into a movie, she only has, the highest praises to sing about Nick Hornby's adaptation. She was 100% pleased, except for one single thing, which is deciding to name the character David, because that's the name of the man she ultimately married. Her husband's name is David, but in a way she kind of, found that to be somewhat humorous too. The name of the man that she actually had this lived experience with was Peter Rockman, which there is a little Easter egg in the film, in a scene, which maybe we'll get to it, but where Peter Rockman, his name is actually put into the film. So she doesn't name in this book that was something that meant something to her, but I can imagine that it would because of the way it was placed. So if Lynn is pleased with the way that he adapted her story, I can only be pleased. And it is my favorite movie of all time. So I am quite pleased.
I love Wild. I didn't know that. That's so fantastic. And he also was saying that he prefers to adapt other work and he hates adapting his own. He's like, I've already been, working on something for 2 years. I don't need 2 more years with it,
Understandable.
And so it's a pleasure. And yeah, he seems to have a talent for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's move into the story, the plot of the movie, and we'll continue to unpack the themes as we go. So this is going to be some spoiler territory eventually, but we were talking about both the adaptation and the direction. And I thought right from the start of the film, I felt like I was in really good hands with this director. I don't know if you experienced that, but sometimes with a movie, like within the first few shots or first couple of scenes, I'm like, okay, I can just let myself go and trust where this story was going. And I felt that way. Just the opening sequence, we had a kind of montage of all girls school shots. And it very much was like pulling me into, this is like the world of young women. Like the activities they were doing were all very gendered. Like the opening shot was them with like textbooks on their head, working on posture. And it just kind of brought me into the world. I'm going to be in this like 60s from the perspective of a young woman and what they're going through. And then we, get introduced to Jenny. So we have these montage shots and we have this really nice tracking shot that comes and lands right on Jenny. And immediately we get a sense that the note that I made was she's the Hermione Granger of this story. Like she's like smart, on top of it. And
she's alert to life in a way that the other girls around her do not seem to be.
Yeah, and engaged, leaning forward. And then we get introduced to her father, Jack, played by Alfred Molina. And then we get a real sense that there is a specific dynamic between his father and daughter.
Okay, so here's something that was cool that I had never considered until watching this with Tyler the other night. He was the one who actually kind of like did the math backwards and was like, oh, an explanation, maybe the explanation for why the family dynamic that both exists the way it exists in Jenny's family and why she experiences it the way she experiences it is because her parents would have been, so it's 1961, she's 16 years old. So she was born at the end of World War II. So her father would have likely been in combat, and London was bombed to hell. So her mother's nervous system would have been impacted. Like she's living in a house with these two people. She's coming of age in a moment where she's alert to life in a town, in a place, in a family, in a community that's still recovering from, literal and figurative shell shock from the war and having internalized this idea that the world is not safe. And she's coming up into the world wanting to imagine for herself how safe and exciting the world could be. And that creates this really palpable tension. And it was interesting because I've only ever watched this movie, again, until Tyler pointed that out to me after, with this kind of pretty unfair characterization of like, why can't her dad just? And it was when Tyler was like, well, here's a big glaring explanation of a reason of why her dad is like, why his nervous system is the way that it is and why he has this perspective of like, especially there's a scene much later where he has this blow up about her Latin grades. And of course, the blow up kind of, you get to the core of it for him, which is survival-based fear of, he starts ranting about money, how there's not money for the, and so you identify, it's done so well, you identify that his core fear is survival. And he's screaming and screaming and screaming, which placing it in current context of the way we understand appropriate parenting would not be acceptable. But like, I don't know, it just that illuminated something for me about the dynamic between their relationship, which then I do think comes back later in the kind of tender moment they have towards the end of the film through the door, where he is able to kind of admit to her and to himself that fear has been kind of the guiding underlying motivation of his entire life. And so that I feel like sets up this tension between like the sort of unhealed masculine and like the budding feminine that causes what you then kind of see play out in the film in the way that allows her to kind of be drawn to this seemingly healed, quote unquote, masculine, offering her this alternative option of the world. So yeah, I had not placed that in context before until Tyler mentioned that. World War II, duh, obviously.
That's a great point. She would literally be the first baby boomer, 1945, which is the year my dad was born a year later. So he's also.
Mine was born 2 years later. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really helpful framing. So just as a tangent here, so my parents are British. They're immigrants to Canada. And my grandparents came over soon after with them. And so I lived in this home of British immigrants. So there's a lot of familiarity there for myself and just what was going on in that family dynamic. And it's funny, I've actually been rewatching for the first time in 20 years, Band of Brothers, which is this very masculine story about these men in World War II and their relationships. And I've been watching it for the first time since it came out through this somatic lens. And I'm like, oh my God, no wonder this generation is so closed off. So many men went through the most vulnerable thing you can go through, which is life or death circumstances. And those that made it, of course, you just want to close off and just keep everything safe and not open up anymore. Like war is its own kind of vulnerability. And an entire generation, my grandparents and then my parents experiencing that immediately afterwards, I can understand why everything now is about safety.
And then you have this like additional expression of vulnerability of you have a 16-year-old daughter who is so hungry for life and you have no idea how to offer her any of it. And, again, there's a moment later in the film where they kind of reference to her, like, her mother says it to her when they're enjoying their time with David and she's like surprised to see them embodying this kind of lightness and frivolity. And she says, we had an entire life before you came along. And that is true. But also, again, if you place it in the context of like the war, what she's really saying there is we had an entire life before you came along. And what happened before you came along was this, hugely disruptive event for us as individuals. Like she can't admit that to herself or maybe doesn't know how to articulate that. So it's additionally vulnerable to have, which I see in the tension between the father and daughter in this film is I feel very much like her existence and the way she's existing in the world. The reason why unconsciously he's trying to kind of manage it so much is because it's reminding him of a hunger for life he had previously that he has no idea how to get back to. So he's both proud of who she is in the world. And this is something David then references, like, of course, you know your daughter better than anyone, and she wouldn't be how she is if not for you. Like she comes from you, which again is like a fascinatingly true statement that he says to manipulate, but it's also true. And you see it hit Alfred Molina's character. You see it hit Jack in a way where it like settles him and he feels seen in that moment. And so I just think it was this watch that I really saw the father-daughter dynamic in this movie more than I think I've ever really noticed it before.
To add to what you're both saying, it would make sense that this generation that went through the World War, their parents would have gone through the Depression, right? So there's such an evolution of what is fun, what is safe. And so that proportion.
What is life for even? What's the point of it?
For the meaning and the balance that adolescence brings up between safety and adventure, right?
Yes.
Novelty and tradition, like breaking away or being a part of your era. But, I think for all of that kind of like broader analysis, the most basic, like human level read I had on the families, they're quite unique in the power structure. They all have each other. They're all listening, even if they have their roles and they have their idiosyncrasies, they're actually quite modern in the way that they respect their daughter, in the way that they love each other, and that the way they each let them be themselves. And they seem to have a type of balance that it doesn't look like they're in an unhappy or oppressed family. They just have the stress of becoming that middle class aspirational thing, which makes sense, again, coming out of everything that we were talking about. But we like them as a little family. Sweet.
Excellent point. I love that point. That feels, again, a thing I'd never really overtly noticed, but that I could feel into, but couldn't define as like, yeah, there's kind of an equal power distribution in the relationship. And that's fascinating to see between like parents and their teenage daughter.
Or where gender was at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk a bit about Carey Mulligan. This was the first time, I remember when this movie came out, it was the first time I'd ever heard of her. She really...
I think it was her first major role, I think.
I would think so, yeah, for sure. And she really popped and has worked pretty consistently, maybe not movie star status, but certainly leading lady, and has carried some movies. I'm wondering your relationship, both of you, to Carey Mulligan as a performer and other things you've seen her in.
Well, the only other movie I considered very briefly bringing up for this conversation was Promising Young Woman. And then I realized I don't want to do that to myself. I
Loaded.
Yeah, I don't ever want to watch that movie again. And that's a testament to how well done I think that movie was. And then, I mean, she was excellent in that. And apart from this movie, my favorite role of hers is Maestro. She is unbelievable as, I wish I could remember her name right now, but Leonard Bernstein's wife. I'm a huge Leonard Bernstein fan. So again, she keeps kind of doing these movies that I feel like are made for me. So maybe someday I'll get to tell her thank you for that. But yeah, I think she's absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, I think she's perfect for this because she's a stunning and strange animal. It reminds me of Emma Stone in that sense, that they're just
I link them together in my mind a lot.
Yeah, there's a type of precocious timelessness that they both, very much like Jenny, just like, how does a person like that come to be? Who's so old ready?
Yes.
Who's so apt. I think Carey Mulligan has a different vulnerability than Emma Stone seems to carry as her in her own life, but they made her audition her little pants off. And she was always the lead choice, but she had to audition over and over and over again because they weren't sure if they wanted to launch. They were really trying to check if they wanted this project to launch her. I think she had significant stage experience before this and had done a smattering of roles, but never anything where she was carrying it.
That is so interesting. I love the knowledge both of you have on the backgrounds of these things because it really adds to my experience of the film. I feel like with Carey in this role, the thing I'm struck by every single time I watch it is kind of what you said. She transcends age. She shapeshifts second to second. It's like she'll embody, it's not even just what she's saying or how she's saying, it's like the stature she's saying it with, which is like, it's so obvious how a grown man could like fall in love with her. And then she'll giggle and you're like, this is a 16-year-old. It's like so obvious, but she's holding those two things together. And the shift between them is seamless. It's just all Jenny. It's all Jenny and her ability to embody that, like, do you say older girl, younger woman? I don't know. It's that, which, leads to that line later where she's like, you can understand why this young girl, this teenage girl says something like, I suppose, you consider me a ruined woman. And it takes an actual older woman, a real woman to say, you're not a woman, but you understand why she has considered herself to be that way. You can understand how this particular type of precocious teenage girl would imagine herself to be a woman. And the way, just the body language, the facial subtleties, the giggles, the laughs, the tone of how she presents certain words is just, every time I watch it, her expression of Jenny becomes more masterful to me every time.
Stunning. And just a sidebar to what you said, when Jason first pitched doing this episode with you and everything, I said, really? Not Promising Young Woman, eh? So funny.
2017 to 2021 me would have jumped at the chance to talk about Promising Young Woman and be really angry and really revved up about it, which is why I won't do that to myself anymore.
Okay. So education, life education, right?
Yes.
We're back.
The way you're both describing Jenny as embodied by Carey Mulligan, I'm curious if resonated for the two of you in terms of the different ways in which you presented yourself as a teenage girl coming of age. Like, did you present yourself to adults or men differently versus your own contemporaries? Like, what was that like going through the world as a teenage girl?
I lived largely inside my own mind as a teenage girl. I, for the most part, tried to do as little presenting to others as possible. That was not true about my girlhood, but definitely as the awkwardness of adolescence, and then the awkwardness of adolescence happening inside of the construct of like evangelical purity culture, where you're just taught to be afraid of yourself and everyone else, really. I mean, it's presented in different specificities, but particularly around boys and or men. But what matters to say is living so much, I think this is why the character of Jenny and just this movie feels so resonant with how I remember my own girlhood, is I was I was like addicted to imagining that some older man would come rescue me from, the experience that I was having, which again, I now understand quite differently of what I was attempting to accomplish there. But it's almost like the way that the story unfolds. It's like this character got the thing that I was imagining I needed. And then obviously it doesn't go as well as, of course, it doesn't go as well as you think it's going to when you're a teenage girl. But I think once I got kind of out of teenage years, and even referring back to my time, my real kind of adolescent moment of New York City right before seeing this movie. The thing I remember most is, being like 20, 21 years old, feeling very young and feeling old at the same time. But for the most part, having a lot of people around me, everyone around me was older than me. And they were all reflecting to me that their experience of me was as if I was wiser than them. And that was somehow, again, both really confusing and also really confirming. It like confirmed my idea of myself, but it also made me feel a little bit more like lost and alone and like trying to find guidance, trying to find elders, flailing around for the most part, but not knowing how to express that. But I've always been articulate. I've always been quite clever, clever Jenny. And sometimes that served me socially, but that didn't always serve me in the way that I really needed to be served, I suppose, for proper development. Because I was in the same way you kind of see Jenny doing here. In many cases, she gets away with, even with her parents, she gets away with the people around her assuming this must be a good decision because you're making it, because you know how to explain it really well. So it gets a little I feel very seen by that expression of adolescent girlhood in this film.
I think for me, I have some crossover with Jenny and some things I would not have had access to. I was raised, unlike Jenny, in a house. I mean, those parents are providing these opportunities for her. I was raised in a house where everyone was culturally very steeped in literature. I had a political family, so I actually spent my 6th grade in London, England, coming into my girlhood or my teenagehood, and socializing at political parties because of the appointments that my grandparents had, and talking about literature, whether it was Beowulf or like Simone de Beauvoir, or like it was just the expectation and conversation in my family that you had a seat at the table. So I would have had that piece, and I definitely grew up in a family where they wanted to shape your critical thinking, and I could socialize that way, but I also, things were a bit too serious for me to feel relaxed and girlish. And I didn't have the type of investment in myself and solidity that Jenny had. There were things that required my eldership that was beyond my years, that kind of alternately I would rise to the occasion and then get a bit submerged by it. So I was floundering quite a bit more than Jenny did, and didn't have the self-esteem to back it up. But I do think that the cultivated awareness at very, very young and all through my adolescence at how the field of energy, being around a man of various ages, the knowledge that men of so many different ages could be attracted to you no matter what your age was something that was one of my earliest, now in retrospect, I had no awareness of this, was one of the first earliest somatic embedded experiences of body-based holding that I ever have had. Is just
Wow.
how accessible men of all ages would have contemplated me to be.
Wow. Really well put.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I might have edgy questions for you, Jason, along those lines later, but you can choose to pass or not. And it might come up later.
Okay.
But,
I welcome the questions.
Yeah, if there was a gender difference, I'm not asking it now. I'm just kind of framing maybe what it's like to be a man. And because we might talk about the Jenny David dynamic, just what might have caught your eye, even if you were older, what does, and do you think there's a gender difference in terms of how women perceive access to younger men or men of all ages, boys versus women versus men, in terms of what they find, whether it's biological imperative or socialization? I'm just curious about that at some point in this topic.
Yeah, we're going to come on to Peter Sarsgaard and the
Yeah.
arrival of David in this
Yeah.
story. So we could talk about that here.
kick
So
it
let me
down
just introduce
road a bit.
that story beat and then let's unpack
Yeah.
that. So we first see her at the youth orchestra. We get a sense that there's this other boy, Graham, who's a little awkward, but her age.
A true boy. He's an actual boy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when you see so many shows
Lovely.
now where the boys are portrayed by 20-something-year-old men.
Totally. Yeah.
And this was like, oh, Graham, you're actually a teenage boy. And
He's
it's
so
lovely.
sweet. Too.
Yeah.
So cute.
Wonderful. He's a wonderful example
Yes.
of a boy, a young man.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And there's an awkward interaction between Jenny and Graham. And then she walks home in the rain. And then we have a meet cute with the David character played by Peter Sarsgaard, who it's a meet cute I'd never seen before, where he's worried about, that was air quotes there, about her cello getting wet and invites the cello into the car and eventually her into the car. He's instantly exciting for Jenny. And that starts off this relationship with David. Before we jump into that, I was curious about Peter Sarsgaard. So for me, I can remember him in Garden State. It's probably where he might have popped for me.
Yeah.
The Zach Braff movie.
Yeah. He's
like-
excellent in that. He's my favorite character in that movie by
Okay.
far. Yeah. Yeah.
And then he often plays characters where you think he's the good guy, and then he turns out to be the bad guy because he's Peter Sarsgaard. And there's something about
There you go. Yeah.
there's something about his resting face, which is like, I'm being nice to you, but I'm really evil. Or I'm not sure how to describe it, but
Yeah. He's perfect for this role. It's like a smarmy charm thing going on. And again, too, if you see this movie a second or any subsequent time, this meet cute takes on a totally different tone because it does at first come across as this very he's charming, right? He's charming on the offset. And I think she's really drawn to him because he meets her in this area of intellectual rapport and banter that she is above and beyond everyone else, including the adults in her life. So there's this natural chemistry. And I don't want to give too much away about what you kind of find out at the ending of this and what is true to Lynn Barber's lived experience. But this was a more predatory move than it seems when you're first watching this movie. He kind of works on you at first. At first, you're kind of you're with Jenny in the fact that you're doesn't want it. You're suspicious, like she is, but he wins her over so fast and he wins you over so fast because he seems so charming and real and authentic and personable. And that's, I think, again, excellently played by Peter Sarsgaard.
I would say Dead Man Walking, as far as back as that. I think it was when he
good
popped for me.
reference.
But yeah, because that's one of my favorite movies of all time. So I'm a big Helen Prejean fan and Sean Penn fan and him. So yeah, I just think he's all things wonderful as an actor and very pliable in terms of ethics, in terms of what he can portray, for sure.
Yes.
So she gets in the car. He's meeting her in ways that her friends and her family have not been able to do. It feels like he's maybe filling a gap in her ability to converse and be excited about the arts, because she's both very smart, she's engaged in her studies, and genuinely seems to enjoy them and learning and music and art. And he's experienced in that way and knowledgeable and can have conversations and pull her along. So she gets pulled into the world of David. And we'll unpack this in a moment, but then essentially the second act is Jenny's new life hanging out with David as David works his way into the family, into her life, and begins to woo her and eventually, I suppose, seduce her. Ashley, you were asking about the gender difference with you, perhaps as a teenage girl, understanding that men might be attracted to you, might have access to different ages. That's certainly would not have been my experience as a teenage boy at all.
No, I was asking from the other point of view, as you as an adult man. I love hearing that also you as a young man wouldn't have conceived of that. And also what I'll share is that people that I love and really respect in my life who share with me deeply, who are adult men, they say that there's not the same, for me, there's a certain age gap where I'm looking at a young boy and they're a kid to me and I feel maternal or I don't feel much at all. And their honest opinion is that there's a huge flexibility from 12 to, and of course this is edgy territory because we're also talking about some things that could go into territories that are more pathological and everything and paraphilias and things like that. So I think it's a really important conversation for this film about that flexibility? And do you think it's as flexible? And also, because some people wouldn't have chosen to take on Jenny, they would have chosen a much easier fish. So what does that say about David? And because people really think of him as a manipulator first. That's like, even on the festival circuit, that was all the feedback Peter Sarsgaard was getting. And I think it's really interesting that he picks a truly brilliant person that I think he has a lot of respect for as well.
He genuinely falls in love with her, which is its own
Right.
problem, actually, and is quite telling of what's going on in his psychology, that he genuinely falls in love with this 16-year-old
Right.
girl.
Yeah, so interesting.
Mhm.
So anyway, back to you, Jason, if you want to say anything along that spectrum of experience or what you might have to share about yourself and your experience being a man. What's it like being an older man? Do you think that there's a difference in men's ability to be attracted to younger girls? What kind of girl do you think it's always, I mean, you have this mature young woman, and I think it's interesting because like many other older men would have looked for someone much more moldable than her. And so I'm in a sense asking if you would be attracted to younger people, and if so, what type? But I'm trying to frame it in a way that's not like that's safe enough.
Yeah.
And maybe it's too spinny and maybe we don't go there, but you
Yeah.
try to answer and cut it out or whatever.
I hear something in this that may provide some clarity
okay.
here. And
Yeah,
Ashley, what you're asking about, like, there is sort of an obviousness. And like, as I'm becoming, it hit me a few years ago that I was like, I'm not a young woman anymore. Whoa. Like I'm like a woman moving into, like, I'm approaching what we would consider to be middle aged soonish. And so as that path has unfolded for me, the obviousness of like the young part of young men has just become more and more obvious. So the attraction to younger men is becoming less and less and less. And it seems like that is different. That idea of like older woman, younger man, and the potential of attraction there is very different than what we generally tend to see in society and culture as the potential of attraction between older man and younger woman. And to your point, there's a specificity here in the way that he's attracted to Jenny. He's not attracted to genuinely like young girl. He is attracted to kind of the older, he's specifically attracted to the older features in this young girl, which makes it so confusing and problematic. So what I'm kind of hearing in your question is kind of like inviting Jason to kind of imagine for himself like the potential of being attracted to younger women and because it is tricky territory of like, what does that mean? There is agency, but how much? And we're not asking if you are or ever would be attracted to a teenage girl, but like, but there's something interesting to explore in like the ethics and potentials of being attracted to someone in their early 20s. Like there's still to some degree like a power differential going on there, but there's also an authenticity in the connection there. And I do think often, and I see this in David and Jenny's dynamic, I see very much like as much as she is drawn to him because of the way that he kind of opens the world up to him, she's opening the world up to him as well. He's not just opening the world up to her. The world becomes re-enlivened for him because of her experience of the world. And that, I think, is something that's happening often with older men who maybe have not taken responsibility for their own, I don't want to say life, but their own exploration in life, maybe haven't taken the invitation for their own aliveness, often can get kind of outsourced through these constant relationships with younger women, where it's kind of happening, through the lens of the experience they're having with this younger woman. So I may have muddied it up a little bit there with that further explanation, but I'm kind of hearing what you're saying with that question.
If you think about stories, it's like, why this story? So in an education, we understand that David has done this numerous times. But the story that's told is the one about Jenny. And I think that's what makes it unique, is Jenny was unique. And he might have, let's say, groomed other types of teenage girls in the past. And he was doing that again with Jenny. But then Jenny was something different. She was an older soul and she met him in a different way.
He says it to Danny later. He says, this one is different. He specifically says this one is different. Yeah.
So I think there is something, I think he's had a pattern where it's probably been a bunch of different types of younger girls. But in the movie is the movie because this is Jenny and something was different about Jenny. I think I resonate, Jamie, with what you said, where there's a kind of age range of attraction that sort of follows you as you get older. And, my partner is 14 years younger than me. So I'm 49. She's 35. And she's a bit of an old soul herself, and we are in similar places in our life, and it works. It works really well for us. But when you meet people who are in their 20s or who are younger, they're just younger. They're just in a different place. And so there isn't that there isn't anything like within the attraction radar that would want to be connected to that age group. It just shifts as you get older. It just kind of follows with you. I don't know if that's been the experience for the two of you. So that's how I would answer that.
I remember a piece of my own writing actually when I was 24, I was dating someone who was 44. And it was something like she was in her 20s, he was in her 40s, and they met in their 30s. No, they met in their 30s. She was 24 and he was 44. That was the line. There's developmental stages. One of the biggest themes that I see in this film is developmental stages, both for nations, families, and ourselves, and why we always try to get out of them. Like, why are all the people who are older trying to be younger? When we're younger, we're chomping at the bit to have new experiences? And then that's why I think it's so sweet, this young boy who's actually more along a standard line and not trying to get out of it, just has a crush on Jenny and is very present for everything that entails, both the safety and the adventure of it. So something to flag as a potential theme we can continue to pull on. But I've myself have had that experience of, well, right now my partner's 17 years older, but it's way different because I'm 42 now. But when I truly felt that I was dating someone in their 30s when my partner was 44.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm realizing this now. My first real kind of actual relationship in my life was, I think it was an 11-year age gap. I was, 11 years. I was just late 20s, early 30s, kind of that range. And he was, early to mid 40s. And in many ways, I felt initially in the relationship, the story I was telling myself is the reason why it worked is because I felt a greater resonance with someone older than me. And then as the relationship progressed, I realized how much older I actually was than him. And so that's interesting to think about. And then just to provide like an additional fun little piece of context here is that I'm poly and I have two partners right now. And one of them is the partner I live with who's 2 years older than me. And my other partner actually is based back in Nashville, where I moved here from. He's not there now. He's traveling around, but he's 8 years younger than me. So actually my two partners are 10 years and 1 day apart from one another. And it's a really interesting, like even as we were talking about and talking through the like older woman, younger man, it's actually something that has confused my partner Tyler sometimes, like my connection with Keith, because it's like he's so young. Sometimes it is hard to articulate and explain like what's going on there, but there is this resonance of aliveness. And I do think in some ways I am finding, gaining, like maintaining, I'll say, access to like a younger part of me by, continuing to be in resonance with this person. But it's like helping me integrate the maintenance of those younger parts of me and kind of that aliveness in me. And I don't really have anywhere to like land this reflection other than the fact that I'm recognizing like among all three of us here talking about this movie that has this like significant and quite inappropriate age gap because of the ages that these individuals are at the moment of this movie. We also, all three of us here, have these like age gaps in our relationship. And there is a part of me, this is tricky, but there's a part of me that's like, if you remove some of the cultural barriers and you just like wait like 5 to 10 years and maybe like David does some inner work to become a more honest, reputable person, like it could maybe work between the, I don't know, it seems like there is a degree of chemistry that naturally exists between them. But also interestingly, there is this really noticeable absence of real genuine chemistry between them. It feels as the relationship between the two of them progresses, every time I watch it, I notice the ways in which she's kind of increasingly averse to him. And maybe this is a good moment to just mention the thing that I think is really the actual core and crux of the movie, which we're probably getting to in the timeline here in a moment, is the introduction of Danny and Helen. So Danny and Helen, what Lynn says, so Danny and Helen, real people, those were their names. Lynn directly states in her memoir who she actually fell in love with was Danny and Helen. She was not actually in love with David/Peter. She was actually in love with the world, the life, the aliveness that the characters, the real people, but the characters of Danny and Helen were presenting to her as a schoolgirl. That's what she was looking for in life, were options of being able to live that way in the world. And that's actually what made her trying to find a way to get out of the relationship with Peter/David in the movie a little more complex until it wasn't, because of her attachment to the maintenance of the relationship with Danny and Helen specifically.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a whole social context around our loverships and relationships in life. Yeah.
Well, so great. So that's segues us into this next section where she enters the world of David, which includes Danny and Helen. She sees music and shows and experiences cities she's never been to. And I'm curious around, like we were talking about the age thing here. I looked this up. So the age of majority in the UK at that time would have been 21. It's shifted now to 18. And I don't know what the specific law was in 1961, but what it is now is once you reach 16, you can be in relationship with somebody older than you without the consent of your parents. And I'm curious around the consent piece in this story around this older man with the power dynamic, parents and their responsibility. I'm curious if anything came up for the two of you around consent and that Jenny's relationship with David.
So this is something that I think is interesting that I've always thought is really interesting about this movie is I don't, and going back to what I said about the trailer, it seems like it gives a lot away, but in a very real sense, I feel like it presents the necessary diversion for the movie to be really interesting. Is it seems like a really cut and dry story of like young schoolgirl getting seduced. And she even says it later in the movie to her parents, like silly young schoolgirls are always getting seduced by older men, but what about you too? Which is a whole separate thing we could talk about. The dynamic between her and her parents there. But when I watch this movie, what actually makes it so complex for me is, and again, a testament to how beautifully Carey Mulligan plays this kind of shape-shifting amorphous age of an individual, of a young woman that is Jenny. I actually see her as being very in control of the relationship the entire time. There are ways in which obviously there is a power dynamic at play just because he is an older man and she is a teenage girl. There's ways in which she doesn't even realize she's not in control. But there's ways in which, like, for example, it's not a really straightforward, like he seduces her sort of thing when she directly says, I'm 16, I'm a virgin, I intend to stay that way until my 17th birthday. And then she already has this plan to lose her virginity on her 17th birthday. She articulates it to Helen. And then Helen is the one who says, oh, with David. And then Jenny goes, oh, it will be with David, won't it? So she's got this, like in every other area of her life, as the girl that Jenny is, she's got a very clear plan for the life that she intends to have. And David just happens to be this piece that is here at the time. So, okay, you're here. You want to have sex with me. I guess I'll have sex with you. And then the, incredible scene where they finally make it to Paris and they have sex and she's smoking in the window. And I'm sure both of you caught this, as I love it every time I watch it, where she's like, so interesting, like all of that poetry and all of that music for something that lasts no time at all. And it's funny. Like, okay, well, she's going to have better sex in her life. We know this. We hope this for her. Yeah. So there's something, I don't know, it just feels thematically, every time I watch it, it's really complex because I'm like, she feels like the one in charge. Like he's the one that, as he starts to notice that the expansion she's experiencing in their relationship and the maturity, like Danny is starting to fall for her in a way. And then, David's character he desires to rein her in. The exact thing that drew him to her is now the exact thing he feels like he needs to, put the lid on so that, he that is then safe. And even the scene where he kind of haphazardly proposes to her when he starts to feel this building energy between her and Danny, which really is representational of the building energy between her and the world, her and life. He can't stop that, but he wants to. So he thinks that possessing her, controlling her will make him feel safe. Like in that moment, it very much feels like she has all of the power, which is so interesting because she's 17 and he's frantic and he proposes and she doesn't give him an answer. And it's not as straightforward as like older man seduces teenage girl and what you expect to be kind of that typical story.
Yeah, I think what I'll say to kind of add to that, because I love what you said, is that the movie it can be easily just thought as that. And I think that was the difference between my first viewing and the second. I actually think it says a lot more about life and questions around how we should educate our children and questions about where is the line, like, and how do we prioritize development versus soul. It's a lot about life choices. It says a lot about class systems and how that's embedded in Britain and aspirational capitalism as people are learning how to build wealth differently with established nations. And like, I think it says a lot more. And I don't actually see him try to control her that much. It seems like more acts of desperation. I understand what you're talking about, and I agree that she has a lot of power there. And also, Peter Sarsgaard said that they're like teenagers. That's how he viewed it. And he also agreed that his character has a sense of love, and that's what he was hoping everyone would see. But his experience was that all the men were like, I need my daughters to see this. And all the women were like, yeah, it's men. That was his experience, and that everyone used the word manipulative first for his character. And he's like, I'm actually hoping that they see the love in his heart. I hope. So there is something to be said that whether you're ready or not in adulthood, you have access to power that other people don't, and then it becomes responsibility. And I think that's where things get really mucky. Immature, undeveloped people, and also people who have to take things on that aren't maybe developmentally ready. But like what I was saying about my own childhood is that I got kind of bifurcated by an early wisdom and a real innocence that I didn't know how to be my own age ever. And so, yeah, I think access to power, he's got a vehicle, he can buy tickets to Paris, he can have a wife and no one knows. I mean, how you present yourself is how he maneuvers himself in life. And yet there is a desperation to him that seems to feel that being a chameleon and maneuvering people is his only strategy throughout life.
Yes.
He says to her, what are we supposed to do? We're not as brilliant as you. So then there's intellectual superiority, and you also see that between David and the father's character, right? You know, like, oh, they hate us over there. I can't possibly go to Paris. I can't do that. They don't even like us, you know? So yeah, so that's my little bit about that. Jason, what about you? You're raising 3 teenage girls, 3 various ilks.
That was super helpful, but what both of you shared, thank you for that, because I wasn't looking at it through that lens. So that was helpful. Because later we'll get to this, you know, she holds her parents responsible for the mess she gets in from this relationship. So I was asking myself, how responsible are they? How responsible would I be in that situation? Now, I have definitely a different relationship with my girls. Like, they know the work that I do. We have open conversations about all of these things. There isn't any shame in this household around those conversations. And so they tend to tell me basically everything, and we have open conversations around it. And I trust their wisdom in relationships. And I know sometimes they're going to learn some hard lessons, and that's okay. Failure is welcome here. So I'm not in the same situation as the Alfred Molina character, but I did wonder if there is a place where you just have to say, this is not safe. There's a power element that you don't understand. I'm sorry, but I'm cutting you off. Now, when you do that, of course, that just gets buried in it. It can be expressed other ways. So I'm not really sure what Alfred Molina's character could have done, except maybe be in a better relationship with her in the first place that's trusting, where they can talk openly about these things. But it's tricky. So I don't know that I have any easy answers.
Well, it's beautiful, your relationship with your girls, first of all. And I think the parents get pacified by their own class intimidation. They lose some of their agency. It's also about their family structure and the kind of the evenness of the power. They know they believe in their daughter, and they feel that she's a different breed than them as well. And so they kind of plan her life like she's the racehorse they're betting on. She's an only child, and they want to give her everything, which is why, you know, she is so loved and esteemed and why she feels powerful. Yeah. So for Jenny and for them, there's such an automatic, like, it's already hard to know. Kids deserve to push against their parents and their parents to be solid, but they also had the wisdom of loving their daughters free and, for lack of a better, more respectful word, superior spirit in terms of agency in the world and what she might have access to. And they wanted her, okay, well, we can only take you so far, so we'll give you to the school. Oh, great, David, you say that he loves you. He seems to like us, which we believe is happening. He seems to have more worldliness. Go with him then. Like, they seem to always be trying to help her fly. So I think it's both a very just and wise and intuitive comment that Jenny says, and richly unfair, because he counters later, but you lied to, like,
you said it was
lying.
okay.
Yeah. And so there's actually, we see the innocence of the parents through the entire film. And so it's so beautiful. We're back to developmental questions about parenting. Parents are growing at the same time that they're raising children. It's all a bit of a clusterfuck. I'm surprised any of us are getting by. And it's the divine comedy, you know? But in some senses, the parents had a right to go, but you guys are foxier, more wily. more worldly. And we chose to trust and believe you and love you and empower you. So don't manipulate and push against us and then come back. And so anyway,
I excellently said. I think that for me is this like very stark, once again, the shape-shifting, age-shifting of Jenny, her very unfair, quite immature response of like, she wants the rules to be as the rules are of like this equal power distribution until she gets herself into a mess. And then she demands that her parents should have protected her from it. And I'm not saying there isn't like a young part of her, like a proper developmental, need that is now on the surface crying out, and that, sure, we can have that conversation. And I feel like it once again illuminates the fact that this is a teenage girl, like kind of throwing a tantrum about rules she doesn't like now that were working out perfectly fine for her 5 minutes ago until she experienced the consequences of her own choices. And now she wishes she could have been saved from the consequences of those choices. And that's not a totally fair way to read it.
So, where I see the best representation of it, because things are even in scenes differently, is at her birthday when they are planning. They're kind of more of a team at that point in manipulating the parents. Because at first Jenny's watching going like, how is he getting them to do this? Because she's been taking the direct route and he's been helping them feel parts of themselves that they haven't felt. Like he's very, very good with people, right? And when the dad gets super scared about not being socially ready enough to go to Paris, she actually has a moment that looks like a 5-year-old where she takes her presents and hides beside the couch.
Calculated.
You deal with that. I want to open my presents and I'm going to get Paris. And so the dad has a younger reaction, like maybe, for lack of a better term, a younger boy who doesn't know if he's going to live up to a different language base and, saves face by saying, we're not welcome there, it's them. And then she has a tantrum and then David negotiates it and we're off again. So,
and then they have that look from her behind where you can tell the look they have is it worked. Like they planned every part.
They're like the velociraptors, they hunt in pairs. They're like, you go that. Yeah.
Because she knows how he's going to react. And so she knows that she's like, if I regress to the 5-year-old that has the tantrum, then they will want to totally. Yes, I'm so glad you caught that. Because I actually, again, didn't really even catch that shift. And, they're both plotting this together now until this watch 2 days ago. I was like, oh, that look they did this one together. I had not caught that until this watch.
In fact, one quick thing is just watching the different types of archetypes that try to come and rein her in and shape her, whether it's Emma Thompson or Olivia Williams, who does probably the most mature job of that. Trying to say, I respect you, I respect my life, and this is going to shape you and you could pay for this. Versus Emma Thompson putting restrictions and being like, you don't get to mess with me, child. And trying to put her in her place like that. She's a bit of a rocket ship, and it's like unwieldy, trying to rein her in and also respect her at the same time and teach her about life. This is, I think, the biggest parenting issue is how can you have enough trust with your kids that when you say something about life that they have no experience with or resonance with in their body, that they might give it some credence. And that's what the whole film is about. Practical experience versus cognitive stuff that we try to push into our kids with no banked, actual on the ground learning, which I do think education models. I hope we talk about that for a flash at some point. But anyway.
Well, and I think it's like you said, it's brilliantly expressed through the fact that like Jenny's sniffing that out the whole time. She knows that her parents are not people worth believing regarding what they believe, what they are telling her is true about the world, that it's all unsafe out there. But they're not giving her anything different, which is why when David walks in and he's like, no, it's great out here, she's ready to eat that up.
So we've been hinting at what happens next, which is we find out that David is in fact married, has a family. She's been betrayed because he proposes. She, as you said, Jamie, I think you mentioned this, she doesn't actually answer right away. Her parents are like, why not? And then you don't have to go to school. Then you're taken care of, which also feels like a betrayal. But then she does say yes. And then we discover he's married not that far away with the family and kids. And he's done this before. And so she, of course, breaks up and leaves him. And she's in this mess because she's dropped out of school. She's given up at that point going to Oxford, which was the goal before, and now is trying to put her life back together. And I'm curious, both of you have been hinting at this. What is the education? What was the education that she received here?
I think the climax of the film, actually, and for me, like the most important scene in the film is that really impassioned speech that she gives to Emma Thompson's character about where everyone in her life has been like, it's just hard and boring and you just have to do it. And then that's life. And there's been this like, and this is the part that always, every time I've watched it, felt so resonant with me and my girlhood, my adolescence, my experience as a young woman, and who I still understand myself to be now, which is just like, there's been this seed in me of like knowing better somehow. That when that's what you see in Jenny, where, she wants more, or she's hungry for life in a way that no one is telling her, like, that it could be fun at all until David enters. But then like he brings her into this world of possibility that almost like affirms this, it like manifests the dream that she has been like wondering if it possibly could be the reality. And I feel like this to me is like the core of the movie, where she's like yelling at Emma Thompson, who's like trying to talk sense into her about like living life the right way. And she points out that what everyone has been telling her is like, the path to where you're telling me I'm supposed to go is hard and boring. And then you're telling me once I'm there, it's going to be hard and boring. So I have lived with an alternative option here that is not hard and not boring, and that feels really aligned and true to what I want out of life. Like this, I believe I am alive to live. And I haven't observed anyone really alive around me until I met this man, and then he introduced me to some other people who are really alive. So I pick that. And that I feel like is the moment where we see, regardless of what happens with David specifically later, there's no going back from that, which is why it makes so much sense to me that then she, takes the path of asking the teacher to help her get into Oxford. And what I'd feel confident in knowing is the way Jenny lives from that point on is fundamentally different than if she had never had that affair, than if she had never been brought into that world, because that's what she was looking for. That's really, in my opinion, like the path of the story this movie is telling about womanhood or girlhood going into womanhood is a path of, desiring to find, I keep saying it over and over, but like the true aliveness that life is here to offer you. And she does find that. And it's not technically through David, it's through her resilience and how she maintains that part of herself that she found in that relationship with David, and still kind of, even though the people around her, the adults around her, like Emma Thompson, were technically correct about being suspicious of this man, they were still wrong in the version of life that they were offering her and telling her was required of her. She was right about that part. So I love that part. Again, if you've seen this more than once, you know what's about to happen when she's yelling at the headmistress, thinking she's correct about like, my life is going to be this structurally, like the form of my life will be this now. But I think I'm in a yoga teacher training right now on this idea of like form and essence. And she was wrong about the form, but she was right about the essence. And she knew it. And the other people around her kept telling her she was wrong, but she wasn't wrong. And she knew it.
And I think we make this mistake with kids a lot. We distill it to too fine a point, or it's too reductive. There's also greater truths, like there maybe was love and there is expansion. A safeguard instead of acknowledging the other parts, and then it becomes limiting. Jamie, I have a question for you. So part of what I'm feeling about the movie and a cross-section that you were sharing about your life is that we do our kids a disservice by not having embodied education. So we're stuffing things into their mind, or we're stuffing in ecology, like an offering to our kids about how they should live. And you got offered one that you said kept you in your head. And you said something like that there was a lot of difficulty when you came into your body and you hurt yourself. So I have questions about how that was for you, and how you see, the way I'm framing that in my own head is that when we're not teaching our children through embodied means, or when parents are parenting in a disembodied way. So we see the parents aren't alive, they're not proud of themselves, but they're trying to make the kid alive and proud of themselves. And there's that gap. What are we doing? How did that affect your life?
Real resonance with Jenny there too. And disclaimer here, I love my parents, and they did an exceptional job with what they had to work with, and in enormous and myriad ways, their floor was stories above their parents' ceilings. And they did not feel, for deeply understandable developmentally based reasons, feel safe to embody their own lives as they were parenting me. So it did leave me with exactly like you just said, like I was being like told things and I wasn't seeing things modeled. And then because of the addition of being raised in evangelicalism, there were a lot of things that I was not only not being modeled, but I also wasn't being told because those things were off limits too. And so I did kind of have this really chaotic, like intense and impactful, we'll say. I don't conceptualize it as being damaging now because I believe everything is, healable when meaning is made around it and it is integrated and released through the body. But for pretty much all of my 20s, I was just kind of flailing around trying to figure out like what it meant to be in a body. And so I was seeking a lot of stimulation and intensity without thinking about or knowing how to consider like short-term and long-term impact on my like spiritual, emotional, mental, relational well-being. And I don't know what my parents could have done better. I had a similar relationship with my parents in this like power differential thing where they always just trusted me. They were always like, if you say it's a good idea, go for it. And I have in the last couple of years just told them, especially as I'm moving. So I'm a step parent now. And in the next like year or two, I will be on the path of becoming a mother, a biological parent as well. And just even like moving into the step parent role and considering having a baby, at the sheer terror of the vulnerability of like these people existing in the world where things can happen to them. I look at my parents and I'm like, I was 18 years old, 17, I actually think, when I told you guys that I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to go to Africa. And you said, great idea. How the hell did you do that? Like, I'm like so amazed by and impressed by like the way they found the ability to teach, even though they couldn't model. And it was chaotic for me. And I did flail around and I did hurt myself primarily through having sex with people that I just like was not fully embodied and online for to be making conscious, sovereign decisions about what kind of sex I wanted to be having. And those were all learning experiences, all of them, every single one of them, even the ones that felt really violating at the time. And so I feel very passionate at this point in my life, especially as being a new parent, about exactly what you just said about like modeling, what it means to be embodied and be in your body. I feel really passionate about translating somatic experiences into understandable terms for brand new people in their bodies, where, for example, we'll talk to my stepchildren about like, if I'm noticing dips in their energy or mood, I will talk to them about like, hey, and I'll literally just tell them sometimes like, I've been in one of these for longer. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about like how this kind of works. And like, if you think about what you ate this morning or like how much screen time you used, or like, this is why this morning, there's an interaction with our 10-year-old who really wanted to like, he's excited. He has Skype on his phone now and he wanted to text his friend and just Tyler and I articulating like, hey, using your phone like first thing in the morning is like, because he asked for it and we said no and he was upset. And we're like, hey, things happen to your brain. Like it's harder to put the phone down for the rest of the day when you use it first thing in the morning. And we're not telling you this as in an accusatory way of saying you're doing something wrong by asking for the phone. We're just telling you like, this is true in our experience. And when I eat certain things, like this is what happens in my energy level. And when I make certain choices, this is what happens in my body. I think it's necessary to have developed the skill of somatic literacy in your own experience with your body in order to learn how to articulate that to like small new people here, brand new in their bodies. And I think that's really scary and intimidating when you don't have that skill, but you don't even know you don't have that skill, which is why I think a lot of parents err on either side of like control or, kind of, I'm trying to think of like what the other one would be. I listened to an audiobook on parenting recently, and they kind of set this up of like either telling your kids what to do all the time or just kind of letting them figure it all out themselves. Like there does need to be this way in which both the modeling and the teaching has to come from an embodied place, but you can't offer that if you have not lived that yourself.
I have a few more things to say, but Jason, I'm curious what's going on for you over there.
Oh, I was honestly just delighting in this conversation. And I'm aware that I had taken these notes. I have them here in front of me on my screen, and they were just from my very narrow male point of view of taking in the film. And I'm just like, oh, this is why conversation is so helpful. And just hearing both of your perspectives. And I'm just like looking at some of these notes. I'm like, that doesn't interest me anymore. I actually just want to listen to what's going on here. And that was what's going on. I don't have anything to add. I'm just curious now what you were going to say.
Cool. You know what, hearing you speak, and I love what you said. I think it's really helpful in terms of parenting and how to be humble when we're guiding and how to try and just how imperfect the whole thing is. But for some reason, I started seeing this as a bit of a Jane Austen movie. It's like, what do we do when the young women of start to meet the real world, and how do we frame their expectations? And just what is it to start? How do you start releasing this precious child into a world where they might not know the attitudes and angles that people will try to relate to them with? So that came up, but also I think adolescents are so brilliant because they mirror the ethos of a time. And so there's this whole thing that the movie does. It was like, Britain is bored. And everyone's bored. She's a bit bored. David's bored. Her parents are bored. Why? And I think it's really kind of Britain asking itself a question of identity of like, who are we now? We used to be this major imperial power. And I think it was flagging after a couple world wars, like maybe we don't have such a lust for our imperialist history. I mean, it's continued to an extent, but I would say the empires started shifting there and it went more to America, right? As the new Rome, as it were. And I think there's they're all looking for stimulation. And I think that's happening inside Jenny and inside her parents. And they haven't gone into the 60s yet where they were like, what about love? Maybe that's the next identity thing to explore. But part of why I'm bringing this up and why it's about parenting as well is because, again, we're back to that safety and adventure. What's the proportion that we offer our children? And what we're actually seeing right now is a level of anxiety that kids have never felt before. They're having sex per capita. They used to be 14, the average age where people became sexually active. Now it's 18. And I was reading this book called The Anxious Generation. It's Jonathan's book. What are the factors that are causing kids to feel anxious? And it's because they're not having embodied experiences.
That's right.
Independent, unobserved experiences where they get to test themselves against the world. Too much screen time, too much fear. What happens when kids are unobserved, which is, again, very understandable, but it's actually making for more neurotic children. And so, again, I think we're at this point where you shared so vulnerably, Jamie, where our wounds actually become our scars and they make us stronger. And we have to have practice there. And what does that mean about parenting? What does that mean about allowing our kids and maybe even raising our kids to understand their wounds, not only as sad deficits where they got victimized in some way, but the nobility, the larger mythical thing that's trying to enter, which is our wounds become our gifts.
That is what I feel like this movie is
become
about.
Our curriculum and our...
Yes, brilliant, actually. The first time I ever watched it, I mean, I cry every time I watch it now still, but for me, it's the last line of the film where she has this resilience, she kind of overcomes this adversity and, stays on her life path anyway, but in this renewed vitality kind of way that would have been totally different had she just like remained a schoolgirl and gone to Oxford. Like it just would have been like a muted version of herself. And so that isn't to say that harm didn't occur, but it's not quite that cut and dry. And she doesn't continue to identify with the victimization of what happened to her. And you get to like the kind of like little brief epilogue of the film where it shows her kind of bicycling. She goes to Oxford because she studied, she asked this teacher for help, which love that part of the movie where the teacher is like, I was so hoping that's what you would say. I love that woman, the teacher there, and the relationship they have with one another. Like she's the first and only real elder in that movie. That is actually who Jenny's looking for the whole time and was right in front of her the whole time. And really the only adult that maintained her integrity in front of Jenny, which is why she knew that she could ask her for help. And so, you get to the end, she gets into Oxford, you see her riding this bike and it's this voiceover and she says, the boys she dated at Oxford, and she's like, they really were boys. One of them asked if he could take her to Paris and she said, it's going to make me emotional. She said, I'd love to. I'm dying to see Paris as if I'd never been.
Why does it bring tears?
The insistence upon resilience. Just the way in which there was something about it, like, again, at the life moment that I first saw it, where it was like, you can do that about everything. You can do that about everything. She could have not only allowed her life to be so altered by what happened, but also in the story she told herself about what happened, to where even she could have gone to Oxford. It's so telling that this person got to a point in her life where she was willing to say, and I don't think it's this like suppressed, like that never happened to me, but she's so still hungry for life and is still so, it's not innocent either, and she says that she's like, I probably appeared as like artless and, innocent as everyone else, but I wasn't. And I think it's that final statement of the combination of her saying like, I recognize the impact of the experience I had and it did not ruin me because I decided that it wouldn't. I decided to go to Paris Paris again and experience it as if it was the first time I had ever been to Paris. That is an enormous amount of agency. That's total agency. And that's like, to speak to what you're saying about like this idea of like absence of embodied experience in adolescence now, I think there is something about this story where everything kind of turns out the best possible way it could turn out, because this experience did lead her to learn things about herself. And it led her to learn things about the world. And it did identify for her that it's not as cut and dry as like she had this experience with this older man who introduced her to this world. And then because things went sour with this man, she decided, fuck that world. She said, that world is still for me. I'm going to have it on my terms. That, I think, is what adolescence is for. What that part of life is for is to go, taste, see, experience, do, get wounded, get hurt, break some bones, break your own heart, like have that experience and discover yourself to be increasingly more resilient every single time it happens to you. And I think that's the invitation of parenting too, which is what I feel like my parents always did for me. It was just this like, you can always come home. Do not be afraid to go out. Go, do it, live, and we are here. You can always come home. And it really allowed me to create a home out of my own body and out of my own self. That part being modeled for me. My parents were not necessarily people who they themselves always went out and did, but they always told me that I could, and that if it ever went, it's funny, again, thinking about the life moment. When I moved to New York, when I was considering moving to New York, I was obviously afraid and didn't know how it was going to go. And I remember a very specific conversation with my mother where she was like, go. If it doesn't work out, you can always come home. And then there was a moment where it was like, I was potentially going to move into a really sketchy apartment situation living with two girls who were developing cocaine habits. And it just felt all wrong in my body. And I broke down and told my mom about everything that was happening. And I, in that conversation, I was panicking and I was saying, I'd already put like a deposit down in this apartment. And I was like, but I don't have anywhere else to go. If I don't do this, I don't have anywhere else to go. And she stopped me and she was like, Jamie, you always have somewhere else to go. You can always come home. And I did. I came home. We just said, fuck it to the deposit, to the money I lost. And I packed up all my stuff. And within a month, I had left New York. And yeah, there's something, I don't know, there's just something about that line that just speaks to me about like the insistence upon making meaning in your own experience, no matter what happens to you, and retaining your agency, no matter what happens to you.
It makes a lot of sense to me why this movie means so much to you, because the parents do the same thing. They have their faults, but they always leave the door open. And I think what you've expressed about Jenny is what I would say, knowing you in the short time that I like about you, that you've made meaning and you haven't made wrong. Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Thank you.
I had a graduate school professor, I think, describe what you're talking about, Jamie, of reclaiming your naivete.
Wow.
Even though you've experienced these things, you've been hurt so much in going to Paris, you can go back, reclaim your naivete and experience it again for the first time. Not that you're pushing aside your own lived experience, but you can kind of renew yourself and then try it again or experience it again. That's what came up for me as I was listening to you.
I'm really interested in also how little this movie has to do with sex. And this is also why I love the podcast, is because so much is embedded in sexuality. They chose a romantic lovership of some kind to investigate other things that they really needed to go through or teach each other, or missing nutrients in their life. We could see it that way. And that's why I love that we talk about how we were parented and embodiment, because sexuality is like so dimensional, and it has sometimes the reason why we pair up has so much more to do with our needs and our life stages than, I think, understanding what we actually desire is such a process of maturation. It's really interesting, the topics that we've been pinging off of. We haven't mentioned the breast reveal or the banana offer or like the first kiss.
I had those on my list, and then I'm listening to you speak and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so unsophisticated. You can't bring up the banana. This conversation is too deep.
Here's something to note. The banana thing actually happened. And when I was watching it with Tyler too, I told him, I was like, that was like the only time when we were watching the movie together where I like verbalized something while we're watching the movie. I was like, that really happened, which is like wild to think about. But I think it speaks to like his immaturity, and like her response speaks to this fascinating, like just like shift, and like she's the mature one and being like, David, I don't want to lose my virginity to a piece of fruit. And then he's suddenly like, of course you don't. What am I? It's a really interesting moment.
I wondered if it revealed he had groomed more immature teenage girls, and that had been a go-to move for him. And she's like, not a chance, buddy.
See the points that we're making right now? I love for those of us who are resourced enough, either in our soul or in our family structure, or for whatever, however anyone gets by, that we were able to do the wound gift conversion or find the fruits of our pain. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is the director Lone said of Lynn, she's a lot more armored, and I forget the word that she used, but it was something like not prickly, but guarded than our Jenny. And I think we have to also acknowledge the cost. And I think it's interesting.
Lynn admits that too in her memoir as well, that she was asked repeatedly, like, what did it feel like to see yourself on screen? And she was like, that's not me. Like, this is my story in a very real sense. There was a screenplay adapted from the story I wrote about my experience, sure. But Jenny is so unlike me. Like, she admitted that as well.
That's really interesting that you brought that up, Ashley. That was, I know, I read some excerpts from the memoir, and part of what she describes of the education is things that she regretted learning. So I'm just going to actually read a section here. So she said, I learned not to trust people. I learned not to believe what they say, but to watch what they do. I learned to suspect that anyone and everyone is capable of living a lie. I came to believe that other people, even when you think you know them well, are ultimately unknowable. Learning all this was a good basis for my subsequent career as an interviewer, because she's a journalist, but not, I think, for life. It made me wary, too cautious, too ungiving. The last sentence is, I was damaged by my education. And I think I wasn't sure if I was going to bring that up because the movie is something different. Like, the movie is telling a slightly different version of this story and ends on a more hopeful note in a way than from what I can tell, the memoir does, for sure.
Well, you know, where I do find it has a place in our overall podcasting conversation is the narratives that we tell ourselves and how it undermines us and how it contributes to the necessary fantasy of being attracted to someone else. We don't know the world that we're entering when we get attracted to someone else. So there is a necessary lie and a necessary presentation and a developmental appropriateness of not showing all our uglies to someone and being like, the first date, or this is who I am, or spinning ourselves, and this is who I hope to be, is sometimes what people are saying if they're less on the manipulative scale. But if you're higher on the manipulative scale and you're a bit more wounded, it's more overt. But I think the fantasy that they had of each other is something very common in romance and sex. And I think always peeling those layers. So I think there's a place there for accountability, like to what we're projecting and what we're hiding about ourselves always. And that's for everyone. And also how to notice when it's a bit more strategic and calculated, but it's a lot to do with sex.
So we're coming to the end of the podcast, and I'm wondering if there's some final thoughts or final subjects that you both wanted to share or talk about before we end.
Well, one thing that I just realized as you shared that excerpt and I opened my book here on the table, I misspoke multiple times earlier that his name was Simon, not Peter. So I just wanted to correct that. It was someone that she knew through someone named Peter. But yes, the original David, his name was Simon. So I wanted to just bring that up. Right. Something that felt really kind of suddenly on the surface for me, as you just shared that last reflection, Ashley, was the moment in what kind of seems as kind of the relational climax of the film where she finds out that he's married by pulling the letters from the glove compartment. And she's like, take us home, and tells her parents to go inside. And they have this interaction out on the street. And it's kind of like she's inviting him in a way that he likely had never been invited before by any of the girls that he had done this with before, to come into some degree of an integrity and an adulthood in his own life and a masculinity. And, and as exemplified by when she gets the sense from him that he's going to run away from this. And she's angry until she gets that sense. And then she starts sobbing and she says, please don't make me do this on my own. And every time I watch that, I'm like, it's because she knows that she's going to. She knows. And it's not like this tearful like resignation where she moves out of anger into resignation of like, this is over, this is done in the truest sense, and that I'm even going to be alone and cleaning up this mess because he is that immature, he is that cowardly. It's like the total dispelling of the illusion. It's like she finds the letters that reveals that he's married and lives around the corner isn't even the dispelling of the illusion all the way until that moment where she looks at him and she's like, wait, this is who you've been in front of me the whole time. You've been a liar. You've been a coward. You've been this the whole time. Of course you're not going to go face my parents. Of course you're going to leave me to face this on my own. And I think that scene, again, to speak to Nick Hornby's screenplay adaptation, I don't know what the private conversations were between him and Lynn. She doesn't write those details in the story. I don't know how much, happened or not, but let's just imagine it's his imagining of that interaction. Brilliantly scripted, brilliantly acted by both Carey and Peter. I think it's just such a compelling part of the film where you do see the final dispelling of that illusion that she has been, I think, inching towards getting bored with. And so there's almost this kind of, in that resignation, sort of, I read somewhat of a relief too, where she gets to kind of be done with the maintenance, even if it's unconscious, she gets to kind of be done with the maintenance of this routine she's keeping up, as if she's in love with him and not actually in love with the world that he has shown her.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, my final thing is a smattering that has no through line. So
Great.
I just feel like raising hands for Sally Hawkins because she just nails life and she's so cool. So like cool
Yes.
Sally comment. I feel sad for David. As a therapist, I feel like, okay, so I'm glad that we're starting to have tools to understand what women and girls go through in the formation of their character, and how are we letting down men is something in my mind, because I follow Terry Real and I really like what he says about false empowerment of anyone, regardless of any gender, and what that does to someone. And when I think of someone who's manipulative and coercive, I know some of the roots can be that you can never be yourself and you were always managing people. And while I do think that there's a fundamental character, he made his choice in that choice point that you were talking to. I do feel sad about that. And they kept bringing up that F. Scott Fitzgerald action as character in the film. And so I think that's one of the ways it shines. But I also like it as kind of the mirror of what we were talking about education without embodiment, without nervous system regulation, without having our boots on the ground. We talk about war and wonder why we keep repeating the same historical mistakes, but it's conceptual. And I'm not suggesting put people in a position to be in war, but like, how do we manage conflict? Like, even at that level, how are we educating and schooling? And so action, I think it's kind of like the other side of when we educate in a disembodied way, action not being able to be character, and we can pose for each other. And I think it gives much more room for all of us to be manipulated when we're not looking for, we're becoming talking pieces, or like everything's on social media and we look so good. It's like the front end, back end, and all these different types of things. So I wanted to just say that. And then one quick nod to the door scene. It's one of my favorite scenes.
Yeah.
There's so many cherries and gems in this movie. I understand why it's a favorite movie of yours, Jamie. And Alfred Molina behind the door with some couple cookies and a
tea and the biscuits,
doing his best to be accountable. Action is character. He will not. He will try to understand if he should have reined in his daughter, but he was doing the best he could, and he did the inner work. And so I just have a lot of respect for the film too, much more this time.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that scene up. It's just, again, watching it this time, I think in previous watches, I was maybe a little dissatisfied, but this one, I just felt so much of a depth of understanding of, like, for 1961 British father to admit that he has always been afraid, to admit that he got something wrong, and then to reach as far as you're really able to reach in the 1960s in Britain, which is, I'm going to leave you some tea and some biscuits outside your door. Oh, it's just so beautiful. Acted brilliantly. And yeah, I loved that scene.
It just reminds me overall in our life how some people will always pay the price for us and some people will always cost us. In the tabulation of it all, I think he really proves himself as her right father and parent there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that was the scene of the movie for me as well. And the last thing I wanted to share is connected to that, which we've been talking about parenting throughout this conversation. He gets right in that moment as he tells the truth and what his actual motivation is. And I think that is one of the most important things we can do as parents, is tell the truth. That's not to say we put burdens on our kids that they're too young to bear, but I was reading, again, excerpts from the memoirs, and she talked about the moment where her parents said, yeah, marry this guy. Don't go to university. As I'm going to read it because this was such a great quote. She said, this was 1962, well before the advent of feminism. But even so, I felt a sense of utter betrayal, as if I'd spent 18 years in a convent. And then the Mother Superior had said, of course, God doesn't exist. And so her betrayal was, they had been telling this story of what this was about, and it wasn't actually about that. It was about something else, which was their own fear for her security, instead of like an education is important. And that's been the constant lesson for me is children know what's true. Sometimes they can't always articulate it. Sometimes they can't speak it, but they can feel it. And the more out of alignment you are with the words that are coming out of your mouth with what is actually happening, or in your own life, or in the kid's life, or in the family dynamic, or whatever, the more they won't trust you. And so learning to, in some sense, trust your kids, understanding what age they are and their maturity, but to be honest about what's going on for you and what's driving you. And when you screw up, to own it. And if you've learned something that you didn't realize you were motivated by, say in that scene, actually, I was just scared for you this whole time, to own it. And then your kids will trust you. They'll get a sense of what life's like. They'll really gain wisdom. They'll align to truth themselves. And they'll listen to you from time to time when they need a voice. There's an ongoing joke in the house because one morning my middle child was getting ready for a big day and she was doing her hair and my partner was doing her hair with her. And she came out into the living room and one side of her hair was all done up and the other side was a ponytail. Now, what I didn't know was that they were halfway through the process. And what I did say was, that looks great. I'm sure whatever it's going to be. I was like, that looks great. It looks awesome. And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? We're only halfway done. This is just a ponytail. And so now the joke is when I'm trying to share wisdom, the joke is like, how can I trust you? You thought my hair looked good.
Because she knows it doesn't, because she's not even done yet. Yes, that's so good.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
Oh my God, it's the yardstick now.
Yeah, it is absolutely the yardstick. Thankfully, she knows that she can trust me, but that was a moment where I wasn't being honest. I was just trying to be supportive.
Yes. Well, and they're like humanizing our parents too, right? Yeah. Where, what a brilliant example this movie is of that too, for you as the viewer, even if like that's not the lesson Jenny learns. Like I'll just say here to close out, like I wasn't necessarily expecting talking about parenting for like the majority of this conversation about this movie, but it feels really beautiful to me that like I have grown up with this movie. I saw it first as a young woman and I have watched it so many times and I watched it in so many different ways as I've grown. And probably I watched it the way I watched it 2 nights ago, was sort of seeing her more as a teenager that I'm looking at, as opposed to seeing her as like, the representation of me in the world, because I am a parent now. And so it might not have been Jenny's lesson, but I feel like it's something that every viewer one of the many things that can be pulled from watching this movie is just like, your parents are people too. and that goes in both directions. Like, you are still a people as a parent, and you do have the ability to, within appropriate bounds based on age, like develop the kind of open, honest, trusting relationship with your children. That is what we longed for and needed with our parents. And we can also still see our parents as people who did their best with the tools they had and showed up in the ways that they were capable of showing up in regards to us. So yeah, it's just another facet of this movie, just, viewing it through that lens of the parenting relationship too. So I could truly talk about this movie for like 3 more hours. So I'm glad you're cutting me off.
Part 2, an education.
Yeah, totally.
Well, this has been a rich discussion. Jamie, thank you for both saying yes to joining us. It's been such a delight to meet you in person and now have this conversation with you. Thank you for suggesting this movie. This has been a very rich conversation. I'm really grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you. I with how much I've loved this movie for so long, and it's been such a solitary thing for me, I didn't know how much I wanted something like this. Like, just like people to talk about just the themes and the depth and the importance of this movie. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that gift. And even if this never aired and wasn't like a piece of media itself, like I'm happy. My life feels richer to have had this conversation with both of you. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please remember to rate, review, and follow. And please share the podcast to anyone you think would enjoy it. Remember to click the link in the show notes to take my Hidden Relationship Patterns quiz to start improving your relationships today. And reach out if you need support. Thanks for listening. See you next time.